We're still here in Matthew 25. Matthew 24 and 25 is a sermon about the temple falling, Jesus coming, and the end. And it's called the Olivet Discourse because it was a sermon preached on the Mount of Olives. And it concludes with 5 parables about waiting for Jesus' coming. First was the parable of the thief in the night, where we were told to stay awake, ready and watching for Jesus' return. Then the parable of the wise and the wicked servants. We're told to care for our fellow servants as the master told us to do. And now we come to the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, and we're told to have enough oil to go to the banquet when he comes. We're going to see the parable of the talents, where we'll be told to do God's business by taking risks to get a return on his investment. See that next week. And then finally, the parable of the sheep and the goats, where we're told to take care of God's people as we would care for him. Now, the first 3 of these parables emphasize that Jesus may return either sooner or later than we expect. And then the emphasis slowly shifts through these parables from Jesus' return as a surprise to what we should be doing while we're waiting for him to come. There's a parallel to these first 3 parables in Luke 12, not in the Olivet Discourse, so it sounds like Jesus told these parables at other times also. In those parables, it is male servants who are tending lamps while they're waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet. And then they're told to watch for a thief and to watch for their master's return. And the master serving his servants at his banqueting table is the reward after his return. That's the same in this story. We're going to see that getting to eat from his banquet is the reward. And interestingly, Jesus is noticeably absent until the end of all these parables when he comes with a reward. So how is Jesus' return like a thief, like a master, like a bridegroom, like an investor, and like a shepherd? So far, we've seen that Jesus will come suddenly like a thief, and that he wants us to be caring for our fellow servants because he is their master, and that's what he would do. So now, Jesus suddenly arrives as a bridegroom, and we're told that the bridesmaids must be ready. Need to acknowledge a couple difficulties in understanding this parable of the wise and foolish virgins. The first issue is, how can we understand this story when our wedding traditions are so different from the ones in this story? C.S. Lewis pointed out that when fairy tales were written, the place that the fairy tale starts was as common to the audience as it is foreign to us. When you read the Chronicles of Narnia, the kids are surviving World War II happening, and that's as strange a beginning setting as Narnia is at the end. For us, reading this story of their wedding, before we can ask how do we apply this, we just have to understand what's being described in this wedding ceremony, because it is very different from the way that we would do a wedding. So let's read the story and look for similarities and differences with our own wedding traditions. And then we'll reread the story as a parable and ask what Jesus wants us to do because of this parable. Okay? So here's the storyline of the wise and foolish virgins. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil with them. The wise, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. "Sir, sir," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "I tell you the truth, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." Okay, so this parable starts with them going out to meet the bridegroom. That's how wedding ceremonies began. We hold our wedding ceremonies in one location, and we have the groom arrive first and wait for the bride. And for us, all the friends of the bride, the friends of the groom, and everyone in the wedding party arrives before the bride. For them, they started at the bride's house, waiting for the groom to come and get the bride and take her back to his house where the wedding ceremony would go on. That would be where the feast was held. And that feast lasted for several days with free food and drink. This could have been the biggest party they were expecting to go to the whole year. But he is a long time in coming, or some versions say he was delayed. The groom took longer than expected. And waiting for the groom to pick up the bride should not have taken this long. Everyone's right in blaming the groom for this delay. Imagine how nervous a groom would be today if everyone's gathered for the wedding, and now you're an hour past the time the wedding starts, 2 hours, 3 hours, and the bride still isn't there. The groom's going to start getting nervous, right? Start getting nervous. He would be nervous like crazy by then. That's what's happening here. But for them, it was the groom who was to arrive. And the groom might be delayed. Different commentators think he might be delayed actually in the bride's house, having a private meeting with the bride's family. He might even be paying or finalizing the negotiation for the bride price. It might be that's what they're waiting for. Or the groom might be delayed, still preparing the food and the drink at the feast at his house. He's not done getting the meal ready yet, and so he can't come pick the bride up. But either way, everyone would blame this delay on the groom. It's not the bride's fault, it's the groom's fault. He's late. So now, we have 10 virgins. These are young women or bridesmaids, and calling them virgins shows that they're in the wedding party. And if virgins seems like an odd name for these girls, remember that we still differentiate between a maid of honor and a matron of honor for married versus unmarried wedding attendants. We still have a version of this even today. These virgins appear to be friends of the bride rather than friends of the groom, just like it would be in our weddings, the bride's side of the family here. Now, they all fall asleep. All 10 of them fall asleep, whether wise or foolish. That's normal because of how late it is here. And unlike the parable of the thief in the night, where the people who fell asleep instead of guarding the house get in trouble for falling asleep, they don't get in trouble for falling asleep, but for not having enough oil with them when they wake up. And unlike the parable of the wise and wicked servants, where the wise servant was the one who was giving food, sharing food with his fellow servants, this time they are welcomed to the feast because they did not share their oil with the other people who had none. And a cry goes out. Remember, throughout this teaching section, this cry going out, or a trumpet sounding, is waking them up, heralding them to the fact that the bridegroom has arrived. Okay? They're waking up by this cry coming out. Now, they're either wise or foolish. Like the servants in the last parable were either wise or wicked. And being foolish here means being not ready, not having enough oil with them. In fact, did you notice that? It said they did not take any oil with them. They had no oil jars with them at all. While the wise are those who were ready. They had enough oil with them in jars. And people who over-prepare look foolish until they need what they packed in their third bag. right? You ever traveled with someone like this who has way too much luggage and it's ridiculous, and then you're really glad that they had that third thing with them? Okay, now they have lamps with them, but this is a different word than the lamps that Jesus said you could light in your house and that he joked you could put under your bed or cover with a bushel. What we're talking about here is a different word. These are torches. These are big lights. And the oil that they're using here is olive oil. And this phrase that they woke up and trimmed their lamp. Trimming these would be cutting off the burnt part of a wick or the rag that's dipped in this oil and adding more oil to it. And this trimming their lights might be the first time in the story that these lamps are lit at all. Do you still call it that when you get your kerosene lamp burned the first time? You call it trimming the lamp. I don't know if that verb works, but that might be what's happening. In other words, they might not have had their lamps lit at all. They fall asleep. Then the bridegroom arrives. He comes and wakes them up, and they go, yeah, it's time to light our, oh no, my lamp. You can't just light the fabric. There needs to be oil here too. Can you give us some of yours? Now, you need more oil to keep these lamps burning like every 15 minutes. You got to keep adding oil to this perpetually. And so they tell him to go buy some oil from those who are selling. And there's some speculation that a smart group of salesmen would have known about a late night party like this, seen this going on, and been waiting in the wings to sell oil. You know, like you go to a fireworks show and there's the guy selling the balloons and the glow sticks and everything. There could have been people waiting around just for this situation. But the wise virgins are the first characters in this story that look rather unloving. Did you notice that when you read this? Don't you go, why didn't they just share? I mean, they shared in the last story. Why didn't they share in this story? You see, these wise virgins understand the purpose of their torches in this wedding celebration. There were no streetlights. Their job was to be the streetlights for the bridal party. And some versions say there may not be enough for both of us. Other versions say there definitely will not be enough for both of us. See, this is not selfish, but wise not to share oil. It's better to have 5 torches that stay lit for the whole trip for the bride and the groom than to have 10 torches that only burn for half of the trip of the bride and the groom. Okay, they're being wise. They know that the purpose is, no, we got to light up the roads. If we give half our oil to you, the road will not be lit up for anyone. We got to keep enough so we can light the road up here. Okay? This is like when they tell you on an airplane, put on your own oxygen mask before helping others. There's a form of being sharing and helpful to others that really doesn't help anyone. And they've identified that in this story, and we have a hard time seeing that from this distance. Now, in retrospect, they probably should have told those foolish virgins, just stay, it's too late, just come with, say you're sorry, and come with, it's too late. But they didn't, and they missed out because of it. Now, the bridegroom here is the next character who looks rather unloving in this story. Again, be honest, do you hear that and go, why didn't he just let him in? See, the door was shut to prevent gate crashers, or worse, robbers. This party is happening in the middle of the night. And everyone who participated in the wedding procession was invited in to the feast. And culturally, late arrivals to weddings were often shamed first, but usually let in. So Jesus is changing something from the way that they probably would have behaved in real life. It was expected that your own embarrassment would keep you from trying to get in too late. But the foolish virgins missed out on all of the wedding ceremony, but they still wanted the reward. Imagine if a bridesmaid skipped your entire wedding ceremony and then showed up to the reception wearing street clothes, sat down like nothing happened, and ordered off of the fancy menu that you paid $250 a plate to have ready for your wedding. Probably the only reason that you would let them stay is that you paid in advance. And it appears in this case that there was a reason for him to say, No, you can't have the bridesmaid's dress if you show up the day after the wedding to pick it up. You've missed it. It's too late. Now, all of the virgins in this story were invited to the wedding because they were even part of the wedding party. But there is a cutoff time when it's too late to come to the party. Okay? That's how the story works. Now that we understand the story, we can go back and ask how this story works as a parable. What does Jesus want us to do based on this? Now, there are some difficulties in applying this parable of the wise and foolish virgins. The first is a context issue. Remember, this is part of the Olivet Discourse, which is on end times issues. The question is, do these parables apply primarily to Jesus' first coming and being ready for that? Or Jesus' second coming and being ready for that? Or does it apply to all of the time in between? In other words, does this apply to all of those who meet Jesus by dying before he returns? And R.C. Sproul told us this morning in Sunday school that eschatology is the study of all of these end times issues, including our own deaths. Now, the second thing that makes this difficult to know how to apply is the difference between a parable and an allegory. Let me see if I can explain this. Does everything we know about feasts and bridegrooms and lamps and oil apply to this story? For example, the bridegroom throughout the Old Testament is always God. And then in the New Testament, the bridegroom is always Jesus. But if I told you I was going to tell you a story where Jesus is the bridegroom, who would you expect us to be in the story? God's people are the bride. But you know what's weird in this story? The bride's not in the story. Instead, we're asked to think about what it's like to be a bridesmaid at the bridegroom's wedding. See that? So we got to be careful not to mix metaphors. You can't just go, oh, I know where this story's going. I can just fill in all the blanks from what I know about how bridegrooms are used in the rest of the Bible. Okay? For example, Jesus just compared himself to a thief. Did you notice that in the last story? Would it be helpful to us to study thieves and learn everything we can about thieves, and that will teach us all we need to know about Jesus? No, it doesn't work that way. There's something very specific he's comparing himself to. So we've got to be careful when we're using a parable. This is the main difference between a parable and an allegory. Allegories, every single thing in the story has a meaning. And it's right to figure out what everything is. Parables usually have one overarching meaning, and you got to ask, what's the point or the main point of this parable? Okay? So, by the way, do you know what the main point of this parable is? Jesus says, therefore keep watch. You don't know the day or hour. Be ready. Yes, that's the one main point of this parable. So now, there's the last thing that's a difficulty in applying a parable is parables versus clear teaching sections. And the question is, does everything we know about how Jesus saves us still apply in this story? You notice the challenges here? Why do the characters in these parables start with a relationship with the master and then lose it at the end? Isn't it more accurate to describe people since the fall as not knowing the master at all? That's confusing in this. It's helpful to remember that Jesus, during this week when he's talking, was just rejected by his own people who had a covenant relationship with God. But when Jesus arrived as their king, they rejected him. They were not ready to accept him as their king. Okay? And then why are the characters in these parables judged by their works? Aren't we saved by God's grace? And aren't there warnings given throughout Matthew that those who are trying to earn God's favor are the ones who don't get it, and the ones who are coming just saying, we don't deserve it, but we'd like it for free, aren't they the ones who get it? You see, on closer inspection, the characters' actions in these parables show that they have faith in and a relationship with the master. And so their works show that they are the people who have faith in and a relationship with the master. Okay? We need to be careful not to assign meanings to elements in a parable that contradict what we already know about how we're saved from clear teaching elsewhere. And this is especially true because Jesus did not give a detailed explanation of this parable. Jesus' full explanation of this parable was, therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. This parable illustrates one of Jesus' main points throughout the whole Olivet Discourse. He says, you do not know the day or hour of his coming. He says that 4 different times. So, be ready or keep watch. He says that 4 different times. That's the main point of this parable. Okay? So how does this parable of the wise and foolish virgins work? At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil with them. The wise, however, took oil in jars with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others came. "Sir, sir," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "I tell you the truth, I do not know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." Okay, so this parable starts at that time. That's the time when the thief or the master from the last 2 parables arrives. And he's a long time in coming. He arrives at midnight. It's at an unknown day or hour. Jesus' coming takes longer than anyone expected. And we're tempted to blame God for waiting so long. 2 Peter says this. Like Adam and Eve blamed each other and ultimately God for their sin. And like all of us are tempted to blame God for punishing sin at all. We're going to try to make this God's fault. And Jesus instead turns our attention to what we will do in response to what we see as God failing us by waiting so long to judge sin. The question is, will we trust him if he takes longer to return than we expect? Okay, this parable is about the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven is more like this whole wedding banquet than just the bridesmaids part of this banquet. In the Old Testament, it often referred to heaven as God's feast. And Jesus could refer to this in his teaching as there was a Gentile who came to him and he said, there's going to be people who come from east and west and get to eat at God's feast, while some of God's own people aren't invited into the feast. This was a normal way of talking about heaven that they could understand. The Messianic banquet, or the wedding supper of the Lamb, is another way that heaven is described in Revelation. Okay, and now this part of the parable is about virgins. And prior to the Reformation, there were a lot of people who argued that this is why we should all be monks or nuns. You can learn that right here from this parable. Just you should stay unmarried. That's how you prepare for Jesus to get back. That's not what this is teaching. What we're doing here is we've got the bridesmaids as the characters we're focusing on. And we've got 5 who are wise and 5 who are foolish, which continues the theme that there are only 2 groups that we can be in at the final judgment. Those who are taken or those who are left. Those who are wise or those who are wicked. Or those who are wise or those who are foolish. And 5 who get into the banquet and 5 who don't is a terrifying percentage. But when you think about it a little bit longer, if half of the people in the world make it to heaven, we'd actually be pretty impressed by that percentage, wouldn't we? Okay, and now we're looking at the oil in the lamps. Oil in lamps is used as a common example of God's presence in both the Old and New Testament. Oil was used in the tabernacle to keep the lamps burning. And God's people are described as the lampstands that are kept alight by God's Spirit in Zechariah. And then the lampstands are the churches shining for Christ in Revelation. That's a common metaphor here. But there's a caution. The oil and the lamp is where most of the allegorizing or importing what we already believe from the rest of the Bible about how we're saved into our understanding of this parable. You see, Christians agree that we're saved by grace through faith in Jesus. But we all tend to import our different understandings of exactly how we're saved into this parable to explain how the oil and the lamp relate to each other. I read about 20 different commentaries on this. There was none of them that agreed with each other on what the oil and the lamp meant. But you could tell what their theological background was by what they said the oil and the lamp was. So is this works being added to faith? That would be what Roman Catholic authors said. Is this love being added to faith? That's what John Wesley said. Is this faith being sustained by grace or means of grace? That's what Martin Luther said. Or is this the Spirit's power being added to our lives to enable us to stand to the end? That's what John Calvin said. But Jesus' explanation of this parable focuses on our being ready, not on defining the oil. Jesus didn't explain exactly what he meant by the oil. It was fun singing all of our other, give me wax for my board, or give me gas for my Ford. It's like those are all examples of the things you need to do that. To drive, you need gas. To surf, you need wax. I guess I've never surfed. I don't understand. Never surfed. Let's keep your board smooth so it'll go well. The point is, you have to ask this question elsewhere in the Bible. What does it mean for us to be ready? Jesus does not explain that thoroughly in this parable, okay? And we need to acknowledge when we're bringing our own understanding from elsewhere into a parable in the Bible. And it's good. We can do that. But that's not the point of this parable. Okay? So he says, give us some of your oil, they said. And in the last parable, the servant who was in charge was supposed to share the master's food with the other servants. But in this parable, there is something unshareable about the oil. And lots of different commentaries emphasize the personal nature of faith as what can't be shared. And it is true that we all need to believe in Jesus ourselves. But on closer inspection, the only thing that makes the oil unshareable is that it's too late. They say, buy oil, get your own. Entrance into God's kingdom won't be available for any price, but it is still available today for free. Now is the time when we can buy food without cost. Isaiah 55 says, and we can share it with others. The invitation to the banquet has not expired yet. You can still RSVP. We have a free gift available to us all. So don't blame the giver of the gift, God, or our fellow bridesmaids, other Christians, because there will come a time in the future when it's too late to accept it. We're not there yet. But all 10 of them fell asleep. And sleeping was the opposite of watching for a thief from the last parable. But the bridesmaids did not get in trouble for sleeping here. What they got in trouble for was for not having oil. Do you know that in passages of the Bible that talk about eschatology, sleep often means death? Jesus warned that he would be longer in coming than we expect, and we need to be ready to go to the banquet when he arrives, even if we fall asleep first. Which is what all 10 of these bridesmaids did. And when they woke up, they trimmed their lamps, which can mean lighting the lamp for the first time. This is when you need the oil. This is when you need to be ready to go. The time of Jesus' arrival and our waking up from sleep is when it will be too late to get the oil that we need. before Jesus returns or we fall asleep, we can still encourage each other to get oil, to be ready. This is still the time we can share oil with each other. I'm doing it right now. Okay? But there's a door and a gate, which has been used throughout the Old Testament and New Testament as a picture of how we are either let in or kept out of God's salvation. Remember when people sinned, they were kept out of the garden. And Jesus says he is the gate. And we look throughout the whole Bible, and that a gate does two things. It keeps people out or it lets people in. And the door that he opens, no one can shut. And the sin that he forgives really is forgiven. And Jesus has given us the key to let others into this feast in the kingdom of heaven. But now is the time to share this key. Today is the day of salvation, it says in Hebrews. There will come a time when the door will be closed, and after that, there will be no second chances. And that will happen either when Jesus returns or when you fall asleep, and Jesus wakes you up when he returns. We don't like this, but where is it to be outside of the banquet in the dark? We know where that is. In the end, God, however, is not going to stand inside wringing his hands, worried about everyone outside. He's not going to delay the feast forever on account of people missing out on it. The party must go on. This is the wedding supper of the Lamb. He's throwing a party for his son Jesus that he's invited us to. And we must be ready for Jesus' coming because it would be a shame to miss out on all of the fun. God has good things planned, and he's invited us. Now, what they say from outside the door is, "Sir, sir," which is the word Lord, Lord. This word means Sir, Lord, or the Lord God of the Old Testament based on the context of how it's used. And there were people in Jesus' day who said that they knew God and were looking forward to going to the Messianic banquet as soon as the Messiah arrived, but they rejected Jesus when he came. They weren't ready and willing to go with Jesus to the banquet while they were still alive. And arriving to the banquet after falling asleep and asking God to let us in won't work. By then, it will be too late. And the Master says, "I don't know you." Do you know this is how the Sermon on the Mount ends? Some people saying, "Lord, Lord," and he says, "I don't know you." We're saved by whether or not we have a right relationship with God through Jesus. But he is the one who will tell us whether we know him or not. You see, each of us must know God. Or Galatians 4 says, or rather, we must be known by God. Right? Do you know God? Yes, I do. Does he know you? Ooh, that's the real question, isn't it? So the question from this parable is, are you ready and willing to go with Jesus to his banquet when he arrives and wakes you up? The point of this parable is to keep watch. And what we do while we wait is important, but it's not the emphasis of this parable. Instead, we're told what to do before we fall asleep. Here's what to do before you fall asleep. Be ready to go with Jesus to his banquet when he arrives. And we know from the rest of the Bible that faith in Jesus is how we prepare to meet God. And we may look silly always dragging around huge doses of our faith in Jesus with us everywhere we go. But we're only going to look silly until he arrives, and we need that oil for our lamps. We know more about Jesus than this parable reveals. We know that Jesus is God and man, and that he lived a perfect life, and he died in our place in order to purchase us and make us his own. And when Jesus rose from the dead, he said, "Don't be afraid." He also said to his disciples, "Peace be with you. Your sin is forgiven." And you who know Jesus do not need to fear, but can look forward to the feast. In Jesus, all your sin is forgiven, and all the food at the banquet is free, because he knows you. Trust him. Now is the time to be ready to go with him.